Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 133. Knock knock, it's Europe. This podcast is recorded in Te Whanganui a Tara on the rohe of Muupoko, Taranaki Whānui, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira. We are generously supported by our amazing patrons. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/History Aotearoa. Last time, we started Abel Tasman's journey on his expedition to find the fabled continent of Terra Australis in 1642. Today, we will continue that journey where we left off, his newest quote-unquote discovery being named Van Diemen's Land after his benefactor, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Anthony Van Diemen, though we know that land today after Abel himself, Tasmania. When we last left off, the Heemskerk and Zeehan were sailing south in search of a good place to anchor, that they could then launch a landing party onto the island. Not that they were actually aware that it was an island. They had decided to sail fairly close to the coast of Tasmania, keeping an eye on the depth of the water and the weather to make sure they didn't suddenly find themselves dashed on the rocks. While this was happening, they were also recording navigational information, such as Gilliesman's illustrations of the coast and the coordinates. Apparently, this coordinate calculation was relayed to the Zeehan, and when Gilliesmans saw it, he disagreed on the proposed longitude, which everyone else on the ship's council had approved. Due to this, Tasman summoned him off the Zeehan to be given a bit of a talking to. Though what was specifically said to Gilliesmans, and why Tasman thought this was such an affront, I wasn't able to find out. This disagreement would later be recorded on the official chart Gilliesmans drew of the area, but evidently not satisfied with that, he drew his own chart which was not part of the official company record. That map showed Tasmania to be a degree more north and east. He also added on the official chart that Van Diemen's Land was first spotted by the Zeehan, not the Heemskerk. Claiming this first sighting was kinda important in terms of fame, glory and all that. So it wasn't like he was just claiming something arbitrary. Tasman and the other crew members likely would have taken a bit of issue with this if it wasn't true. However, Gilliesmans is the only one who makes this claim. None of the other journals mention it. So clearly this was a very heated discussion that was felt even some time after things had died down. Tasman continued to sail along the coast over the next week or so, having his crew take measurements, draw charts and coastlines, and of course, since they were the quote-unquote first to see any of these geographic features, they got the esteemed job of naming stuff, like Storm Bay 'cause of the strong winds. It wouldn't be until the 3rd of December that they made landfall somewhere around what is now North Bay and Blackman's Bay, just south of modern Hobart. In the landing party was Tasman, Vischer, Gilliesmans, the carpenter, and a few sailors armed with swords and guns. Unfortunately, the conditions were rather rough, and they weren't really able to get anyone onto the shore. But they were still hopeful that they might be able to land somewhere else, so they rowed around to see what they could find. They did manage to find fresh water, which was great, because any chance to take on more water and food meant they were less likely to run out later. But the source they found was too close to the sea, and so the surf made it undrinkable. They also determined that the land was too rocky to dig a well. Probably the most interesting thing they found, though, was a nicely laid out veggie garden. And not only that, they saw some steps cut into tree trunks, and heard what they described as a horn or gong in the distance. Later, when they returned to the ship, the crew reported seeing smoke beyond the hills. Just as they had anticipated, this very clearly indicated there were humans living in the area. The question was, though, where were they? No one had spotted any human figures on the coast or beyond, but given the evidence, they must be around somewhere. Were they just away right now? Or were they hidden, watching these big ships just sitting there? What made this even more perplexing was that the steps cut into the tree trunks were apparently 1.5 metres high each. To me, this would indicate that they perhaps weren't steps, but maybe terraces or seats of some kind. But the Dutch interpreted them as steps, and since they were so large, it must mean that the people who used them were giants. In any case, no indigenous people were spotted. You might also be wondering why the carpenter was brought along. Well, he had a pole with the VOC logo carved into it and the Dutch flag waving around. It was his job, when they made it to shore, to plant the flag as a mark of claiming the land for the Netherlands and VOC. Quote, so that to those who shall come after us, it may be clear that we have been here and have taken into possession and property the said land. End quote. As I said before though, the sea was too rough for them to make any meaningful landing. So, instead, the carpenter just jumped into the water, swam ashore, and planted the flag into this new land. Some sources make this event out like the carpenter was overcome with patriotic zeal, which motivated him to jump into the surf. But others claim it was Tasman, who, upon realising they weren't going to make a glorious entrance onto the beach, ordered the carpenter to jump in and just get the bloody job done. The addition of Vischer and Gilliesmans to the landing party indicates that they likely planned to do more charting work, and it was here that they did the last coastal drawings of Tasmania. After this excursion, the ship's council met and decided that they didn't really want to remain here. The winds were pushing them eastward, meaning they wouldn't be able to hug the coast in the same way they had been, which would make it harder to explore the landmass. And well, east is where Terra Australis likely was, and the passage to Chile. Those were their main goals, and is where they were going to find the most wealth and glory. The wind, or perhaps God himself, was pushing them towards where they needed to go. He wanted them to find, as Vischer put it, all he had ordained there. All they had to do was follow the winds of the Holy Spirit. Or something like that, probably. With that decided, on the 5th of December, the Heemskerk and Zeehan lowered their sails and pushed on into the Great Blue once again, leaving the extent of Van Diemen's Land mostly unknown, and missing the much larger landmass just to the north. The next 8 days were relatively uneventful, but on the 13th of December, things got a bit more exciting once again. If Tasman thought he had seen big mountains in Tasmania, he was going to be in for a bit of a shock. What they saw on that day was not just one or two, but a series of huge snow-capped mountains. Specifically, the ones just north of Punakaiki, on the west coast of Te Waipounamu. What he was looking at was the spine of the island, the Southern Alps. Finally, it's good to be home. Given they were the first Europeans to gaze upon this land, Tasman once again had the privilege of naming it. Except this time, he didn't give it a name after a person, or what it looked like, or something notable that happened. In fact, he actually kinda didn't give it a name at all. By that I mean, Tasman thought that what he was looking at was the western edge of Staten Land. I'll forgive you if you don't remember what that is. So to remind you, in 1616, a guy called Le Maire had sailed to the southern tip of South America, and there he found a piece of land which he named Staten Land after the States General, the governing body of the Netherlands. Le Maire didn't sail all the way around Staten Land to find out whether it was an island or if it was something larger. and no one had really bothered to do that since, so its size was still up in the air. Tasman, seemingly, had put his money on the fact that it was a much larger continent. Likely that the coastline Lemaire had found was the eastern edge of Terra Australis, and that what he had just found was the western edge of the same landmass. With that done, Tasman called his council to decide what they should do, easily agreeing that they should sail closer to the coast to record data, as well as to try find somewhere to anchor. Initially, on approach to the shore, they spotted no smoke or other signs of human settlement. So, as far as they were aware, they were the only people here. At least, for now. Over the next 3 days, they sailed closer to the shore, until they were off of Kahurangi Point on the northwest coast of the South Island. From there, they proceeded to follow the coast northeastwards. As they had done in Tasmania, they made sure not to get too close to land, for fear of the wind driving them onto any rocks they couldn't see. The next day, the 17th of December, they spotted a few plumes of smoke rising into the sky, a surefire sign that the land was inhabited, which was put in the ship's journal in a rather matter-of-fact manner. Quote, "In the morning at the rising of the sun, were about 1 mile off the shore. Saw in various places smoke rise where fire was made by the inhabitants." End quote. I find that kinda underwhelming. Sad, even, that it's written like this without any emotion. I understand why this was meant to essentially be a corporate document that others would read and use, but Abel, my guy, you just found evidence that the human species made it to the farthest corners of the globe. Is that not exciting? Does that not make you think about how amazing human ingenuity and willpower is? Not to mention that these people likely have a culture that is vastly different to your own. So much to learn and see and do. Of course, that isn't really what the attitude was at the time. So even if he was allowed to write with a bit of pizzazz, I doubt he would have talked about how excited he was to meet whoever these people were. At this point, the ships were likely in the vicinity of Whanganui Inlet, just south of Cape Farewell. That's the sticky outy bit on the top left of the South Island that kinda looks like a kiwi beak. This natural harbour possibly would have been a decent place to anchor and send a party to look for supplies, but Tasman, showing his usual precaution, anchored in the open sea for the night, so they would have good visibility when the sun came back up. Given its natural advantage as a harbour, we know that there were Māori living around the inlet as well. Although we don't have evidence to suggest the Māori on shore spotted the ships, it's pretty likely they did, since the ships were fairly close and rather large. We also don't know how they felt about seeing the ships. Curiosity at these strange vessels? Fear of who might be inside them? Aggression to make the first strike to protect themselves? Some combination of all three, or something else entirely? We just have no idea. Pretty much all we do know is that if the residents of Whanganui Inlet did spot Tasman's ships, which again is likely, they probably thought the ships would come into shore by morning to talk or trade, because it seems a runner wasn't sent to other nearby settlements to inform them of the ship's advance. Though, to be fair, we aren't entirely sure of that either. One of the pa that likely would have been informed was at Taupo Point, all the way on the opposite coast in Mohua Golden Bay. Evidently, by morning, Tasman either didn't spot Whanganui Inlet or decided not to go in, because at about noon on the 18th of December, the ships rounded Farewell Spit, and as they did so, the hulls would have been within full view of the lookouts at Taupo Point Pa. That afternoon, the council decided to send a party ashore to look for food and fresh water, which would probably be acquired more easily by chatting to the locals. Before they could do that though, they first needed to find somewhere within the bay that would shelter the ships and allow them to anchor on a more permanent basis. For the time being, they laid in Mohua just north of Wainui Bay, right where Taupo Point sits. So the ships weren't just visible, they were practically on the Pa's doorstep. As the ships sat there with men crawling all over them, we don't know what was happening on land. The scale of these ships, the like of which Māori had never seen before, would have possibly fueled a sense of fear and dread as to who these people could be. Or perhaps there was a sense of curiosity. Were the rangatira convening hui to decide what to do? How were those talks going? Were some advocating an aggressive response, while others a more diplomatic one? What was the feeling among the common people? Were they anxious? Excited? Remember, what these people were seeing was like if a spaceship landed on an island in Wellington Harbour. How would we feel just seeing it out there, silent? Or perhaps hearing the distant voices of those on board speaking a language we can't understand? What we do know is that Tasman's crew didn't spot any fishing vessels in the bay, which doesn't necessarily mean they cancelled any normal fishing activity, but may indicate that. So, who were these people, and why don't we know anything about their side of these events? What we do know about the people who lived in the area at the time was that their iwi was Ngāti Tū Matakōkiri, and compared to others in Te Waipounamu, their life was actually pretty good. If you remember from the horticulture episodes, the Nelson Tasman area had a much warmer climate than pretty much the rest of the island, meaning they could grow lots of crops that others couldn't, like kumara, taro, and yams. With the combination of nearby rivers, estuaries, and the coast, fishing for eels, shellfish, koura, inanga, and all other manner of fishes was plentiful, along with marine birds like shags, gulls, stilts, and oyster catchers. In fact, they made sheltered terraces in the river to help them catch fish. There were also lots of fruits of the bush, like aruhe and kereru. Due to their plentiful resources, Ngāti Tū Matakōkiri had a few different pā in the area to protect them, generally set along the coast against cliffs. Naturally, pounamu was a highly prized item, and traded from further down the west coast and across the Cook Strait to the North Island. As for how many people were living at the pā and the surrounding area, well, different sources give different estimates, ranging from 200 to 500 people. I, personally, find the lower estimates to be not quite as likely as some of the higher ones. The reason for this is that these numbers include women, children, elderly, and other non-combatants on top of the male toa. But we know that Tasman saw 22 waka on shore, and at least 11 of those being launched. The 11 waka likely had just over 100 toa paddling them all together. Each one had just over 10 occupants. And so there would need to be at least another 100 people to man the other 11 waka. Some sources say that all 22 were launched at once. But if we take a more conservative estimate and assume Tasman only saw 11 of them manned at the same time, the idea that half the population were combatants is a bit of a stretch to me. It's possible, but unlikely, factoring in children, elderly, and women. I just don't think out of approximately 200 people, half or just over half were battle-ready males, and possibly a few women in there too. This does propose an interesting question though. If there were only a few hundred people living in and around Taupo Point, were allies sent from another area, potentially Whanganui Inlet? The Dutch did arrive in summer, which was the season for war, so it wasn't outside the realm of possibility that a taua would be sent out to help defend nearby strongholds. We don't know for sure though. maybe the upper estimates are correct, which would explain the amount of toa present. Or perhaps the lower number is right and a toa from another area just happened to be there by coincidence. As for who Ngāti Tū Matakōkiri were specifically, they were from the Wanganui Taupō area, so roughly the centre of Te Ika a Māui, and in the late 16th century were forced out of their rohe by various conflicts. They eventually made their way south until they got to Mohoa Golden Bay, where they managed to displace or assimilate the local Ngāi Tara, who were originally from the Wellington region and descended from Tara, who gave his name to Te Whanganui a Tara, as well as the iwi itself. The reason we have so much doubt about what was happening within the pā is that, as far as scholars are aware, no oral Māori account exists of the first contact between them and Europeans. This could just be down to the fact that they didn't see the event as important enough to bother remembering. It's just one random incident that never really went anywhere. However, I think if you saw big strange ships with people on board speaking a different language, and I won't spoil what happens, but it does get pretty exciting, that might be worthy of keeping in the oral histories. Then again, maybe not. Ultimately, that doesn't really matter though, because even if we assume that the story was passed down, there is another reason it hasn't survived. Ngāti Tū Matakōkiri would eventually be displaced or assimilated by other hapu from the east, Ngāti Kuia, Ngāti Apa, and Rangatane, as well as Kaitahu from the south. Ngāti Apa would be the ones to take control of the Mohoa Golden Bay region in the early 19th century, after a series of battles just north of Greymouth. Not long after, Ngāti Apa were turfed out themselves by Te Rauparaha and his allies in the 1820s. Tū Matakōkiri, as individuals, did survive both of these takeovers, but as a cohesive political unit, they were gone by, at the very latest, the 1810s, which is primarily why we don't have any contemporary information of what was going on in Taupō Point Pā when Tasman turned up in 1642. Next time, we will see how these two cultures briefly crash into each other, and who comes out on top. Because, in my opinion, there is a winner. If you want to get in touch, my email and social media are on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt A-O-T-E-A-R-O-A. You can also find helpful resources there, like transcripts and sources. If you'd like to support Hans, you can do so through donating via Patreon or just giving us a review. As always, haere tū atu, hoki tū mai. See you next time.